Hello, today we are going to install a VNC server on Ubuntu 24.04. We're going to use the package tigervnc, the server package. Tigervnc is the default server for VNC in Linux operating systems. Let's connect. This is a virtual machine, Ubuntu 24.04. Let's connect. First of all, I would want to actually install a SSH server. So let's start the terminal. And the package is named OpenSSH server. This will allow us to connect to the virtual machine in a text user interface mode from a terminal. This will allow us to actually copy paste from this web browser. We don't actually need to use a web browser inside the Ubuntu 24.04 virtual machine. And then once we install tigervnc, we might want to use the security features provided by the SSH server. So we leave tigervnc using a not secured protocol between the VNC client and the VNC server, but we're going to wrap all of this communication between the VNC server and VNC client inside a SSH tunnel. So now that we know how to connect to the Ubuntu 24.04 virtual machine using SSH, we actually don't need the graphical user interface session anymore. Let's just disconnect if we know how to do that. Let's connect to the virtual machine using SSH. We need the IPv4 address. So SSH, username, IPv4 address, says that I'm connecting for the first time to this computer. Let's provide the password. And now let's look at the instructions on how to use tigervnc, which can be found on the best wiki for Linux software, which is the ArchWiki one. Let's see how to use a VNC server. So there's a man page. Okay. And we need to start by running VNC password to create a password as our current user, so not as user root. We don't have the tigervnc server yet, so let's install that. Apt search VNC. There's tigervnc-viewer, tigervnc-standalone-server, xorg extensions. There's also tightvnc, but we're going to go with Tiger. Let's install this one. Apt install tigervnc-standalone-server. What we want to get is a feature set similar to the RDP server on Windows. which means that you're not actually connecting to the real hardware, monitor, and keyboard. You're not forced to use the resolution of the existing monitor. These features are, for instance, provided by the application TeamViewer, where you actually connect to the hardware monitor and you cannot change the resolution inside TeamViewer without actually changing the resolution on the monitor. So if somebody looks at the monitor, even though you're connected remotely using TeamViewer, that somebody will be able to see how you unlock the screen, how you move the mouse around. So we don't want such a thing. We want the monitor, the hardware monitor of the computer to be something totally different from our VNC session. Okay, we've installed a tigervnc deb package. Let's log out, not be the user root anymore, back to our regular user, and let's continue. We want to set a password, and this requires a at least 6 characters password. And then it asks if I want a viewer only password. No. Next up, we want to start the VNC server just as is without any additional configurations. As our current user, our user can use the sudo command. And the command for that is VNC server. But let's look at the man page a bit. So the man page for VNC server is the one that we want, which is the Tiger VNC server, not the Tight VNC server or any other one. We want to see the full output from the server. We don't want the server to background itself and become a daemon. We want to see the standard output and standard error from the server in our terminal. There's different configuration files in tilde/.vnc directory. There's other configuration files in /etc/tigervnc. The display numbers start from 1, and that means TCP port 5901, and then they increase from there. So display number 4 would be TCP port 5904. Then there's localhost yes, which will make tigervnc server only listen on the network interface card of the localhost. So you will not be able to connect using the hardware network interface cards or the wireless network interface card, which is great if you want to use the SSH protocol. Okay, so VNC server. Let's look at the help. There's geometry, which specifies a width x height. That's an initial resolution. We have the port number. We can kill a running and probably backgrounded VNC server. And we're going to start with this one, stay in the foreground. Okay, so VNC server -fg. And go. Okay, so it has started the display number 1, that's :1, TCP port that we expected, which is 5901, this guy. Now we want to connect from the host computer, as it were, to the virtual machine. The host computer is running Ubuntu 24.10. It needs to have the client deb packages from tigervnc installed. Let's see if that's the case. Nothing. Apt search, VNC, and client. Nothing. Tiger. Probably this one, tigervnc-viewer. Let's get the IPv4 address again of the virtual machine. vncviewer is the application. It requires a IPv4 address or a host name, and then the port. So the desktop number. From the desktop number is going to compute the TCP port. Authorization required, but no authorization protocol specified. Is that? Okay, so don't run the VNC viewer as the user root. Don't run the VNC server as the user root. Both should, for now, run as the non-root user. Now says connection refused. So previously the error when we tried to connect using the VNC client was unable to connect to socket, connection refused. So that sounds like the TCP server is not listening on that TCP port 5901, and that can be confirmed by installing the Debian package net-tool such that we have access to netstat, and then using netstat we can confirm that on port 5901 there's a TCP server that's listening, but only on the localhost TCP v4 address, which is 127.0.0.1, and then on the TCP v6 localhost IPv6 address, which is ::1, which is not okay. We're connecting from a host computer to a virtual machine. We're traversing using the TCP protocol from one computer to another, which means that the TCP server needs to be listening on all network interface cards, not just on localhost. And you do that, for instance, this is the change when we run sudo netstat -ntlp again. Now instead of listening on localhost, it's listening on all IPv4 addresses. And instead of listening on localhost IPv6, it's listening on localhost all IPv6 addresses. The change, if we look at the manual for VNC server, there's this option, the only option that talks about network interface cards, is this one, minus localhost, possible values yes or no, which says that if enabled, VNC will only accept connections from localhost. So the VNC server has a configuration file somewhere, or a default, which was decided at compile time, which says that localhost yes. So the VNC server will only listen to the localhost network interface card. That's a good setting and a good default if you're always using SSH to tunnel the VNC connection. But since we're just getting started with installing the VNC server, we don't know exactly how to install it. We're just figuring things out. We're starting little by little, and the simplest way to start is to just start the tigervnc server and not background it as a daemon, make it run in the foreground such that we can see its standard output and standard error, and then connect from another machine without any SSH tunnel, but we'll upgrade to an SSH tunnel. So we'll need to run VNC server or Tiger VNC server with -fg command line parameters, but also with the command line parameter -localhost space no. And this is the command that we're using. So VNC server or Tiger VNC server -fg -localhost no. And now also the standard output has changed. Previously it said that in order to connect to this VNC server, you will need a command line like :1. And now it says you're going to need a command line like the hostname :1. So this thing has changed to this thing. Let's see if we manage to connect. So we need the VNC password, which is the at least 6 characters long one. And we are somewhere. This is the VNC client application, Tiger VNC. And what are we seeing in here? I'm not exactly sure. So this was a first run wizard, which is before GDM runs or after, when a Linux user logs into the X server for the first time. Let's see where we get. So we totally do not want to connect using the VNC protocol to the X11 session that runs as the user root. We want to run as the user administrator. We did not specify any user, unfortunately, when we connected from the VNC client. So the command line is like this and does not specify the user that we want to use on the Linux machine, on the Ubuntu 24.04 virtual machine, where the VNC server is running. It complains something about the Spice VD agent, which is something related to QEMU. It's probably that for the user administrator, the VNC server settings maybe are not complete, like the X session, X init RC. We're into something which resembles GNOME, but we don't have, for instance, a window manager. We cannot move the windows around. We can see that it's connecting to the correct session, to the correct X11 server, because we have the VNC client is using the same password that I provided for the user that's non-root on the virtual machine, both on the guest and the operating system, and inside the virtual machine, the username. No. So inside the virtual machine, the user name is administrator, but by the fact that the VNC client has accepted the password that I have set for the user administrator, I can see that it's connected to inside the title bar. It says administrator in here. And also, if I'm looking at the accession errors, I can see some information. We can also prove that it's using the correct user, which is the user named administrator, because inside the home directory of this user administrator, there's a .vnc hidden directory, and in there's a log file, and we can see that if we delete this file and then we restart the VNC server, then this file will be generated again. And there's no way to connect to any other user than the user administrator, because we're actually running this executable VNC server as the user administrator, and we're running VNC not as a systemd unit or a system-wide daemon. It's just a simple command line process that's running in the foreground as the current user, which is the user administrator. No matter what I tried, I could not connect to the virtual machine Ubuntu 24.04 using the VNC protocol towards the default Ubuntu GNOME X11 session. The only thing that worked for now, and this is what I'm going to provide, and here my research is going to stop. I found online that you can install an older package which is called gnome-session-flashback. So I've run this command line, sudo apt install gnome-session-flashback. So gnome-session-flashback. And then when I'm listing the directory /usr/share/sessions, previously in here there were only two files, ubuntu.desktop and ubuntu-xorg.desktop. And now there's two additional files, gnome-flashback-compis.desktop, which probably uses the compis window manager, X11 window manager and composer. Whereas this other file, gnome-flashback-metacity.desktop, uses the metacity window manager and compositor. And then I needed to edit the configuration file for the VNC server, which is tilde/.vnc/xstartup, to contain some random content that I just found on the internet. I searched on the internet for Ubuntu VNC server GNOME session. There's something wrong with the systemd local session or with some environment variables, or maybe because of GPU acceleration, something does not work. I couldn't get the normal Ubuntu GNOME session, the X11 one, to load correctly under the VNC server. So I searched and got to this result, ask Ubuntu, which says how to configure tigervnc server to get the full GNOME desktop. The only thing that I managed to do is to install the xterm package and then just launch xterm without any window manager. That worked. But then from that xterm, if I try to start anything else like GNOME session, like GNOME shell, everything will take us to those images with a not or incorrectly started GNOME session with error messages. The window manager fails to start. The window manager complains that the window manager already exists. All sorts of issues, but the full GNOME Ubuntu X11 session just refused to work. And in here it says that I should install this guy, gnome-session-flashback, which I did. And then it says that ~/.vnc/xstartup content should be this thing without the and ampersand. So you stop here. I just randomly found this content for the xstartup page. I pasted and it just worked. I'm going to guess that this older session uses less GPU acceleration, less LLVM 3D technologies. I know. And this type of session has existed for the last 15 years and has always worked via VNC. And maybe people just do not know that the new GNOME shell GTK4 session X11 just refuses to work under VNC. Or maybe there's not enough knowledge on the internet on how to start that correctly. Or again, maybe there's some simple to fix issues in the GNOME session, but nobody actually found them and reported them and fixed them. Let's look at the content of the file. So it's exactly what's in the web page. Starts with a shebang, then unset session manager dbus session bus address. Then it will execute /etc/vnc/xstartup, a file which does not exist. Then respects ~/.xresources, sets 3 environment variables, xmod map disable, xdg current desktop, gnome-flashback:unity, and xdg menu prefix gnome-flashback-. GNOME session, and then you provided the name of the session, which is the name of the .desktop file from /usr/share/xsessions, and disable acceleration check. Everything's extremely random inside of this file, but it worked for other people and it does work for me. And this is the result. Yes, it's not the GNOME shell. There's a two-pane style layout for GNOME. The start menu is in the top left corner. There's a places menu. There's a show desktop button, a workspace virtual terminal switcher, a workspace switcher. I don't know how to start applications in here if I just want to search the run. I don't know. Where is the terminal? Yes, we have GNOME terminal. So this is a GUI session that's pretty similar to the default GNOME experience in the default Ubuntu 24.04 Linux operating system. Next up, let's see if we can run this setup via an SSH tunnel. So we want to run the exact same thing in RDP server, in VNC server that's running the gnome-flashback Ubuntu session, a VNC client, and the entire communication should happen over an SSH tunnel. Inside the wiki page from Arch Linux for tigervnc, there's instructions on how to use SSH tunnels, and there's two ways to do it. You either run a command line like this from the VNC viewer, or you could increase the sleep to 20, or you can use a command line like this. This command is extremely similar to this command. So -via actually does spawn a command line like this. Let's use the last possibility, this one, vncviewer -via the IPv4 address, localhost, and the TCP port, and see what happens. The VNC server we started the exact same way. We could even allow localhost yes. And then on the VNC client, we run VNCviewer via, and in here, the username on the SSH client is N, and on the Ubuntu 24.04 machine is administrator. That's why we need to specify the username at and then IPv4 address of the SSH server. The same way that we use the SSH command. So the SSH command was SSH space administrator at 192.168.122.117. Okay, so this we took from a valid SSH command line. This is the IPv4 address of the network interface card where the SSH tunnel will function on the SSH client machine, so on this machine, on the host machine. The TCP port to be used on the current machine. And that's it. It asks the SSH password. So it first runs a command like this, where it connects using the SSH client, using this user to this SSH server, and that will require that we provide the user password. And now this part of the command line has been executed. And the next part which runs is something similar to this, whatever, 5901, which will require the long VNC password. And we're at the GNOME flashback session. We can resize the tigervnc client window as we like. That will tell the GNOME to size itself, which is a really important feature, because this, for instance, allows me to use the web browser on the host machine, on the machine where I run the VNC client. I don't really need to run the web browser also inside the virtual machine, which then allows me, for instance, to have a virtual machine that has less allocated random access memory. For instance, I could make a virtual machine of only 4 gigabytes of RAM, the one for Ubuntu 24.04, and then I will run web browsers exclusively on the host machine. Let's see if copy paste works. A text editor. So copy from the VNC client window towards the host machine works. Copy just the part. And the other way, it also works. Bidirectional copy paste of text from inside the VNC client towards the outside of the VNC client to the machine where the VNC client runs. And the fact that I can resize the VNC client window any way I want is enough for me to do my graphical user interface actions that I need to do on a Ubuntu 24.04 machine. Even if the machine is not virtual, maybe it's a hardware computer, but I want to connect to it remotely from another machine, then my go-to would be to install the xrdb server on Ubuntu 24.04. And if that for some reason is not allowed, then a fallback would be to install the VNC server tigervnc on the Ubuntu 24.04 machine. So this is my order of priorities when connecting remotely using a graphical user interface session. RDP first, VNC second. Thank you.